DIY, I made Jack's Christmas chalkboard. To get the frame for the chalkboard, I used a 16 by 20 canvas that I picked up in a 5-pack from Hobby Lobby. To remove the material, I flipped the canvas over and used a utility knife to cut along the outside edge of the staples. Then I pulled off the material and any material that was stuck in the staples. I didn't bother removing the staples because they will not be seen once this project's all put together. Next, to make the chalkboard, I used one of the black foam boards from Dollar Tree. To measure out the size I needed for the chalkboard, I laid the frame on the foam board and used a pencil to draw a line across the top. I also traced the inside of the frame so that I would know where the writing should go so that it wouldn't be covered up by the frame. I wanted the frame to be kind of dark, so I used Krylon Chalky Finish Antiquing Wax in the color Dark Vintage and gave the entire front of the frame 2 pretty thick coats and set it aside to dry. While the frame was drying, I used a utility knife to cut along the top pencil line to remove the excess foam board from the top of the chalkboard. Then I used a sanding block from Dollar Tree to smooth out the edge of the foam board that I just cut. Since I wanted this chalkboard to look as close to the one in the movie as possible, I went to Google and found a picture of Jack's chalkboard and sketched it out on a few pieces of paper so that it fit exactly in the middle of my chalkboard. Then I centered my sketch onto the foam board, taped it into place, then used a pencil and traced the image onto the foam board using a small amount of pressure so that the image would transfer. If you don't want to hand sketch the images, you can Google search for Jack's chalkboard from Nightmare Before Christmas and use your computer to resize the image and print it out, then trace it onto the foam board or freehand it. Here you can see once I remove the paper that the images are visible on the foam board. Next, I took the white metallic marker from Dollar Tree and went over the images on the chalkboard a couple of times to make them look like they were written in chalk. Now, this does not have to be perfect by any means, and that's the beauty of the Nightmare Before Christmas design. The tendrils for the top of the chalkboard, I again used a picture of Jack's chalkboard that I Googled and freehanded the design onto a piece of scrap cardboard I had laying around and cut them out using scissors. I did use a pair of small detailed scissors to cut around the tight spaces in the spirals. Again, if you don't want to freehand this design, you can Google and print out the design and trace it onto the cardboard or foam board. I used cardboard because I found that it was way too difficult to cut the small spirals out of a foam board. Next, I used some black acrylic paint and gave the front, back, and sides of the tendrils 2 good coats, letting it dry between coats. Once that was dry, I took some apple barrel paint and brown oxide, mixed it with a little bit of water, and lightly brushed it across the tendrils on both the front and back. I'm trying to give them the look of rusted metal since that's what they look like in the movie. Next, I took some folk art brushed metal in gold, mixed it with a little water, and lightly brushed it across the tendrils front and back. This time, instead of letting the paint dry, I took some of the brown oxide water mixture and used it to kind of blend the 2 colors together on the tendrils. I am so happy with the way these turned out, and the camera really does not do them justice. Once everything was good and dry, it was time to build the chalkboard. I used a generous amount of hot glue around the edges of the foam board where I'd traced the frame and put the frame into place. The hot glue worked really well to hold this piece together. Next, I hot glued the tendrils to the top of the frame, making sure to put glue anywhere that the tendrils touched the frame for added security. To finish off this project, I took 4 holly berry picks from Hobby Lobby and a random piece of Christmas greenery that I had in my stash and decorated the top part of the chalkboard. I am absolutely in love with how this project turned out. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments below, or if you want to see more Nightmare Before Christmas crafts in the future. For this project, I used one of the 18-inch wreath forms from Dollar Tree and 2 9-foot garlands from Hobby Lobby. If you use a smaller wreath form, you'll only need one of these garlands. I started by wrapping the entire wreath form with the garland. I did want my wreath to be really full, so I did end up wrapping it with 1.5 garlands. To create the eyes for the wreath, I used 2 plastic spoons that I had on hand and painted them with 3 coats of apple barrel paint in the color King's Gold. To make the teeth for the wreath, I used some white foam board from Dollar Tree and a ruler to draw out several sharp-looking teeth. I wanted to have a variety of teeth to choose from when I was ready to assemble. Then I cut them out using a utility knife. I also used a sanding block from Dollar Tree to smooth out the cut edges so that they would have a nice clean look. After picking out the 8 teeth I thought looked best, I took some of the longer skewers from Dollar Tree, cut them down, and hot glued them to the back side of the teeth to make little teeth picks so that I could easily attach them to the inside of the wreath. Any skewers or wooden dowels would work for this step. I just happened to have these longer ones on hand, and I ended up using one and just 1 or 2 pieces from another one. Once the spoons were completely dry, I placed them on the wreath where I thought they looked best and gave it an angry look. Then I took a pair of scissors and snipped the handles of the spoons and used hot glue to glue them into place. Next, I arranged the teeth around the top and bottom sections of the wreath where I thought they looked best, putting the longest teeth on the outside and then the shorter teeth on the inside. Once I was happy with the way they looked, I hot glued them into place by putting the hot glue on the skewers and pushing them back inside the wreath. Again, this is another project that doesn't have to be perfect to be perfect. To finish off the eyes, I used a black paint pen to give them little round pupils. This part is completely optional, but in the movie, the man-eating wreath has arms. And since I had just a little bit of garland left over from wrapping the wreath for him, I decided to flip the wreath over and attach the extra garland using 3 zip ties to hold it into place and create the arms. Once the arms were in place, I flipped the wreath back over and fluffed it up so that it looked nice and full and any of the skewers were completely covered. To add the little finishing touches to this project, I took a large red bow that I had in my stash from last year and tied it right in the center of the bottom of the wreath. Then I took some of the frosted red berries from a candle ring I picked up at Dollar Tree last year, cut them apart and hot glued just a few around the wreath where I thought they looked best. And that's it for this one, y'all. I had so much fun making this wreath, and just between us friends, I've always wanted one of these and I couldn't be happier with the way it turned out. This is going to be another one of those year-rounders for my makeup room. For this project, I used a clear plastic rib bowl from Dollar Tree, a small plastic dessert plate from Dollar Tree, a regular size plastic plate from Walmart, and a large plastic charger from Dollar Tree. First, I took some 150 grit sandpaper and lightly scuffed up the outside of the bowl, just enough to take the shine off of it. I then repeated the same process with all 3 plates so that the spray paint would adhere better to the plastic. Here I'm showing you an easy way you can create a fence out of popsicle sticks to go around the plates if you want, instead of buying a pre-made fence like I did. I picked up some mini popsicle sticks at Walmart and cut one end flat, then created an arrow shape on the other and cut it off with my scissors to create a picket for the fence. You can then hot glue them around the edges of the plate. For my fence, I picked up 2 pre-made picket fences in the fairy garden section at Hobby Lobby to go around the medium and large plate. This fence is a bit larger than the one in the wood section. To attach the fence to the outside edge of the plates, I alternated hot glue and E6000 right under the bottom wire on each of the pickets. I put hot glue on the first picket, then E6000 on the second, and continued that pattern until the fence was completely glued to the plate. I do want to mention that I'm using Gorilla Hot glue sticks. Those are my absolute favorite glue sticks. Here you can see that one fence wasn't quite long enough to go around the largest plate, so I took the second fence and cut off a section to fit right in the gap and glued it into place using E6000 and hot glue. This is what the large plate looks like once it's finished, and I used the same size fence for the medium size plate, and for the smaller dessert plate I used one of the smaller picket fences from the woodcraft section at Hobby Lobby. These fences are completely optional. If you can't find the fences or don't want to make your own, this tiered tray will still be adorable without them. Once all the fences were in place and the bowl sanded, I took them outside and gave them a couple good coats of Rust-Oleum metallic spray paint in the color Flat Soft Iron, making sure to let them dry good between each coat. After the paint was dry, I turned the bowl upside down and took a 2-inch piece of a small tree branch I found outside in my yard and put a generous amount of E6000 in the center, as well as some hot glue around the edge, trying to keep the 2 glues from mixing. Then I placed it in the center of the bowl using the little plastic nub on the bottom of the bowl as a guide. To create the bristles of the broom, I used 2 of the luau skirts from Dollar Tree and started by sliding all of the pieces of the skirt to one side so that it would look fuller. Then I used hot glue and glued it around the middle part of the tree branch. I used 2 skirts because I wanted the broom to be full and I didn't really want to see the plastic bowl peeking out underneath. If you don't have these skirts or can't find them in store, they also sell raffia at the Dollar Tree that would work perfectly for the bristles. After both skirts were attached to the tree branch, I took some scissors and cut off the excess skirt right at the bottom of the bowl. Then I took some jute cord and hot glued it around where the skirt meets the branch so that it would look seamless and to make it look like the bristles were tied onto the end of the broom. To attach each tier to the tray, I used the same combination of E6000 and hot glue. I put the E6000 on the center of the branch and the hot glue around the edge, doing my best not to let the 2 glues mix together. I placed the largest tier on the bottom, then worked my way to the smallest tier on top. The branches that go between the bottom, middle, and top tiers are from the same branch that I found in the yard that I cut for the bottom piece, and they're cut to roughly 5 inches long. When I was placing the tiers, I tried to keep the branches as centered as possible. When I was outside looking for the perfect branch to be the witch's broom, I made sure to look for one that was long enough so I could get all the pieces I was going to need so that it would look like one cohesive piece. I also wanted to find a branch that had a gnarly top on it so that I could use it as the top of the broom handle. A real quick side note here. When you cut the tree branch, make sure you get the ends as straight as possible so that the tiers will set level when the tray is put together. Once the top tier was glued into place, I took the top of my broom handle and glued it in the center of the tier using E6000 and hot glue. And this is how the tiers look once they're all put in place. To finish off this witch's broom tiered tray, I took one of the black rubber mice out of a Halloween variety pack I picked up at Walmart and hot glued it onto the handle of the broom where the branch makes a Y shape. And that's it, y'all. Not only is this tiered tray super unique, but it was easy and quick to make. I absolutely love how it turned out. This is what it looks like once it's completely finished, and I can't wait to decorate it for Halloween. For the first DIY, I used 2 of the wooden standing ghost and 3 of the wooden ghost ornaments that I picked up at Family Dollar. I started by removing the ghost from the bases. This was easy to do by applying a little bit of pressure while twisting. Once the bases were removed, I sanded the bottom of the ghost so that they would be smooth. Next, I took some lightweight spackling from Dollar Tree and filled in the holes on the top of the ornaments. After letting the spackling dry, I sanded it down so that it would be smooth. Then I painted all the ghosts with ivory chalk paint. Once that was dry, I used some dark vintage antiquing wax from Krylon to make the ghosts look old and weathered. I used a foam brush to apply the wax and a wet baby wipe to wipe it right back off. I repeated these steps until I was happy with how the ghosts looked. I then used a sanding block and sanded the ghosts to blend the wax and give them a more distressed look. I wanted an even more distressed look, so I took a utility knife and made indentions around the edges of the ghost, and I also went back in and sanded a little more heavy-handed in certain areas. If you choose to do this with the utility knife, please be careful and don't cut yourself. Once I was happy with the distressing on all 5 ghosts, I took some apple barrel paint in the color Burnt Umber and painted around the edges of all the ghosts and made sure to paint inside the indentations I made with the utility knife and sanding block. I also painted the insides of their eyes and mouth. For the base of this project, I used one of the wavy wood plaques from Dollar Tree. I attached one of the large ghosts to the wood plaque by using hot glue and 2 tumbling tower blocks. I then attached the other large ghost so that it would look like it was floating, and the 3 smaller ghosts where I thought they looked best. I chose to use 5 ghosts for this project to represent my family. The 2 large ghosts represents my husband and I, and the 3 smaller ghosts represent our son and 2 dogs, Cass and Little. You could easily customize this project just by adding or subtracting the number of ghosts you choose to use. I used some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and hot glue to cover the wood plaque and tumbling tower blocks. To finish off this project, I took 4 pumpkins off of some of the pumpkin filler picks from Dollar Tree and used a stick I picked up outside to create a stem for each of the pumpkins. I then used hot glue to stack 3 of the pumpkins in front of the ghost and placed 1 pumpkin behind them. I'm very happy with how this project turned out. It was quick and simple to make. I started with 5 wooden back cutouts that I picked up on Amazon and used some lightweight spackling from Dollar Tree to fill in the holes at the top of each bat. After that was dry and sanded smooth, I painted the bats with 2 coats of apple barrel paint in the color Pavement. Once that was dry, I dry brushed over the bats using a small paintbrush and apple barrel paint in the color Dolphin Gray. For the base, I used one of the Happy Halloween signs from Dollar Tree. First, I peeled off the layer of paper with the plastic coating. This plastic coating makes it almost impossible to paint. With the top layer of paper peeled off, I used a damp rag and rubbed off the remaining paper, being very careful not to get the sign too wet. Once I had all the paper removed, I flipped the sign over and ran a bead of hot glue along all the seams to reinforce them. Next, I gave the sign 2 coats of apple barrel paint in the color Elephant Gray. Once that was dry, I took apple barrel paints in the colors Country Gray and Dolphin Gray and Folk Art brushed metal paint in brushed silver, and using small coarse paint brushes, I alternated the colors using a semi-dry brushing method. It did end up taking several layers of both the Country Gray and Dolphin Gray to give the base the color I was going for. I used the brushed silver to add a few highlights throughout the base once it was finished. I then repeated this step on all sides of the base until I was happy with the way it looked. To give the base a little bit of a distressed look, I took apple barrel paint in the color pavement and dry brushed it around the edges of the entire base. Next, I took some wooden letters from Walmart and picked out the letters to spell the word beware and painted them with folk art brushed metal in the color brushed silver. While the paint was drying, I took some old wire I had laying around the house and a pencil and made 5 springs by wrapping the wire around the pencil. I made sure to leave a straight piece of wire at the top and bottom of each spring. I made 2 shorter springs and 3 longer springs so that the bats would look like they were flying. After I had all 5 springs made, I put them into the base by putting a little pressure on the wire as I was twisting it like I was using a screwdriver into the top of the base. This turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it was going to be to put it through the pressed paper. Once the wire was through the base, I bent the wire underneath the base and secured it with a generous amount of hot glue. I repeated this step on all 5 of the springs, then went back in and reinforced the wire under the base with more hot glue. I put the 3 longer springs along the back of the base, trying to space them out as evenly as possible, and then the 2 shorter springs out in front between the longer springs. Next, I used hot glue to attach a bat to each of the springs. I would recommend using a stronger adhesive for a longer lasting hold. I just used hot glue for video purposes. Then I attached the word beware, trying to space the letters out as evenly as possible to the front of the base using hot glue. Again, you could use a stronger adhesive here if you wanted to. To finish off this project, I used some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree to cover the top of the base. For this project, I started with one of the oval wood plaques from Dollar Tree and a piece of scrapbook paper out of the Spellbound Forest book I picked up on sale at Michael's. I started by tracing the wood oval onto the back of the scrapbook paper and cut it out using a pair of scissors. To glue this piece of scrapbook paper onto the wood oval, I used some Mod Podge and a foam brush. I applied a generous layer of Mod Podge to the front of the oval and used the foam brush to spread it out as evenly as possible. Then I placed the scrapbook paper on top of the oval and used a Mod Podge roller to make sure I got all the air bubbles out from underneath the paper. You don't have to have a roller to do this. You can use your fingers or anything else you may have on hand. Once the paper was smooth, I added a very generous layer of Mod Podge to the top of the paper to seal it. I did my best not to leave any large clumps of Mod Podge on the paper. After the Mod Podge was dry, I took a sanding block and went around the edges to clean them up a little. Then I took some apple barrel paint in the color black and painted the edges of the oval. I tried not to get any black paint on the front of the oval. Next, I took 3 of the tumbling tower pieces from Dollar Tree and used hot glue to glue them on top of each other to make a stack. Then I used a scrap piece of the scrapbook paper and hot glue to cover all but the back side of the block stack. I picked up a skeleton bat from Target. Dollar Tree does carry similar bats, but both of my stores were sold out. Since this bat is meant to hang, its feet are turned around backwards. I needed them to face forward, so I used a pair of scissors and removed both legs right under the knee. I needed to reshape the wings on the bat, so I used my heating tool on the high setting to soften up the plastic at the bat's joints so that I could easily bend them inwards, almost like the bat was giving a hug. It didn't take much heat at all, just enough for the plastic to get a sheen on it. It looked like it was sweating. You could use a hairdryer on high to soften the plastic to make it moldable if you wanted to and didn't have a heating tool. Please be careful when doing this and don't burn yourself. You may choose to wear gloves if you want a little protection just in case. As you can see, I bent both wings inward at the elbow joints and at the wrist joints just enough so that the tips of the wings are easy to push together. It didn't take longer than a couple of minutes to mold the desired wing shape. Once I had the wings shaped, I used a generous amount of hot glue to glue the wing tips together. Once the glue was set up, I did go back in and reinforce the back of the wing tips with more hot glue. If you're worried about how well the hot glue will hold up, you could certainly use some E6000 and clamps to glue the wing tips together. Next, I used a generous amount of hot glue to attach the bat in the center of the oval. I'm using hot glue for video purposes, but I definitely recommend using a stronger adhesive like E6000. With the bat in place, I reattached his little legs, feet facing forward this time. To do this, I just used hot glue, but again, you can use a stronger adhesive if you like. Next, I used some hot glue to attach the stack of tumbling tower blocks right under the bat between its legs. This is going to help the LED candle set straight and not tilt downward. To finish off this project, I used some jute cord from Walmart and some hot glue to create a hanger on the back of the plaque. I did make sure to go back in after the glue had set up and add another generous layer over the jute cord for reinforcements, even though this piece is very lightweight. Here's how it looks all finished and with an LED candle inside. Please do not use real candles in these sconces if you intend to light them. I'm absolutely thrilled with how these came out, so I made 2. For this first project, I used one piece of wood 12.5 inches long that is 2.5 inches wide and 3/4 inch thick for the base. 3 wood pieces that are 3.5 inches wide and 3¼ inch thick, cut to 7, 9, and 11 inches long that I picked up at Lowe's for the pumpkins, and one 3/8 inch dowel rod from Walmart for the stems. I started by measuring out the length I wanted the pumpkin stems to be using the dowel rod and cut them to size. I did end up cutting each piece of the dowel rod a little bit longer than the previous one so that I would have 3 different size stems for my pumpkins. Once I had the stems cut, I used Rust-Oleum stain in the color Kona to stain the entire base and all 3 stems. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Pumpkin and painted the 11-inch piece of wood with one light coat so that you could still see the wood grain. Next, I used apple barrel paint in the color Harvest Orange and painted the 9-inch piece of wood with one light coat. Finally, I used one light coat of apple barrel paint in the color Orange Sherbet and painted the 7-inch piece of wood. Once all the paint was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Truffle and a Dollar Tree paintbrush to distress all 4 sides of each of the 3 orange wood pieces. I did do heavier distressing on one side of the wood for the jack-o'-lanterns. This is how all 3 wood pieces turned out. Next, using my Cricut machine, I cut out 3 classic jack-o'-lantern faces in black vinyl and put one face on each of the boards. Now, if you don't have a vinyl cutting machine, you could use a black Sharpie to freehand the faces or print them out and trace them onto the boards using carbon paper or chalk and then paint them. Here is how all 3 jack-o'-lanterns turned out. I think they're absolutely adorable. For the base, I cut out the phrases, "Happy Fall, Y'all," and "Stay Spooky" in white vinyl. To do this, I just went into my design space and chose a font that I thought fit the seasons. I put the phrase, "Happy Fall, Y'all," on one side of the base. Again, you don't have to use vinyl. You could use stickers or even freehand the words. Then I flipped the base around and put the words "Stay Spooky" on the other side. Starting with the Stay Spooky side, I arranged the jack-o'-lanterns in the order that I wanted them to be placed on the base and used a pencil to mark where the first and the last jack-o'-lantern needed to be placed. Then, using a combination of wood glue and wood glue hot glue sticks, I attached the jack-o'-lanterns to the base. First, I applied a generous amount of wood glue to the bottom of the smallest pumpkin and then added a little bit of the wood glue hot glue and placed it on the base using the pencil mark as a guide. Next, I applied the wood glue to the side of the small pumpkin and then applied both glues to the bottom of the largest pumpkin and placed it down on the base and up against the smallest pumpkin. I used a slightly damp paper towel to remove any of the wood glue that squished out from around the pumpkins. Finally, I placed wood glue on the sides and bottom of the last pumpkin and placed it on the base and up against the largest pumpkin. Again, I cleaned up any of the excess glue with a damp paper towel. To attach the stems to the pumpkins, I just used the wood glue hot glue. If you don't have these glue sticks, you could use regular hot glue, E6000, or regular wood glue to attach them. I put the shortest stem on the shortest pumpkin, the longest stem on the tallest pumpkin, and then the medium stem on the medium-sized pumpkin. To finish up this project, I took some raffia and, only using 3 of the thicker pieces, tied a simple shoestring bow around the pumpkin stem. Once I had the bow tied and was happy with the size and shape of the bow, I cut off the excess raffia, leaving a little bit for the tail. I wanted to be able to twist the bow around to the jack-o'-lantern side when I display it for Halloween, so I did not glue it down or tie it too tight. I then repeated this process to add raffia bows to the other 2 pumpkin stems, and that was it. I am so in love with how these pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns turned out. They match my rustic decor perfectly, and they were so easy to make. For this project, I used 3 pieces of scrap wood that I had on hand. I cut all 3 of them to 6 inches long, and they are roughly 5.5 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch thick. I did not worry about sanding them down or removing the rough spots and wormholes, since I wanted these to be rustic and for one side to be a little spooky. I used the Kona stain and stained one of the wood pieces. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ivory and gave one of the other wood pieces 2 good coats. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and gave the last wood piece 2 coats. When the pieces were completely dry, I took some sandpaper and distressed all 4 edges of each wood piece. Here is how the pieces looked once they were distressed. Just like in the last project, I used a combination of wood glue and wood glue hot glue sticks to attach the blocks together. I applied a generous amount of wood glue and a little bit of the wood glue hot glue to the bottom of the white block and placed it on top of the stained block. When I was stacking the wood pieces, I made sure all the roughest sides were facing the same way, since I wanted the Halloween book stack to be a little more spooky. I then used the combination of wood glues to attach the orange block to the white block. This orange block will be the top book in the book stack. Using my Cricut, I cut out the words pumpkin spice in white vinyl and placed it on the right side of the orange block on the smoothest side of the book stack. Next, I cut out the words falling leaves in black vinyl and placed it on the white block. Then I cut out the words apple cider in white vinyl and placed it on the last block. This is how the fall side of the book stack looks once the words are on the blocks. For the Halloween side of the book stack, I cut out the words boo in white vinyl and put it on the orange block. Then I cut out the words witch's brew in black vinyl and put it on the white block. Finally, I cut out the words Hocus Pocus in white vinyl and put it on the last block. Here is how both sides of the book stack looks with the words on both sides. Next, I took one of these wooden trucks from Crafter Square at Dollar Tree and removed the little ball off the bed of the truck. I used a combination of a utility knife, heat tool, and scraper to finally get the little ball to pop off the back. Once I had the ball removed, I took 3 of the tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree and put 2 of them on either side of the truck bed and the 3rd across the back to act as a tailgate. I took a pencil and marked the 3rd block where I needed to cut it to make it fit, and then I used my mini tabletop saw to cut it to size. After I had the block cut, I took the Kona stain and stained all 3 of the tumbling tower blocks. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color hazelnut and painted the entire body of the truck with 2 coats. Next, using apple barrel paint in the color burnt umber and a small paintbrush, I went around the edges of the body of the truck and drew a small window on each side. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the tires of the truck. I did go ahead and leave the very center of the tires unpainted. Then I used a silver paint pen from Dollar Tree to fill in the windows and the center of the tires. To build the bed of the truck, I used wood glue hot glue sticks and glued one end of each of the tumbling tower blocks to the smaller block. I then used more wood glue hot glue to attach the bed of the truck to the truck. Next, I took some jute twine and wrapped it around the book stack opposite the words and tied it in a shoestring bow on the front of the books. I tied the jute tight enough that it wouldn't sag, but not so tight that I would not be able to slide it off to switch it around to the Halloween side. I cut out the word pumpkins in white vinyl and placed it on the bed of one side of the truck. For the other side of the truck, I cut out the word ghost in white vinyl. I used one of the wooden ghost DIY pins and one of the jack-o'-lantern wooden DIY pins from Dollar Tree and removed the little clothespins from the back of both wood cutouts. And then I painted the jack-o'-lantern with a few coats of Waverly pumpkin chalk paint to cover up the design. To give the pumpkin a little bit of texture, I added a little extra paint and held the heat tool close to it so that it would bubble up a little bit. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory to paint the ghost, and it did take a few coats as well to cover up the design. To finish up this project, I put some hot glue, wood glue, on the bottom of each of the truck tires and attached it to the top of the book stack, making sure the pumpkin side of the truck was showing on the fall side of the book stack. I put the little pumpkin in the back of the truck, and that's it for this easy reversible project. Here I'm showing how easy it is to flip the jute bow around to the Halloween side and then just replace the pumpkin in the back of the truck with the little ghost, and it's ready for spooky season. I think this little book stack turned out so cute. I've made several mini book stacks for my tiered trays, but never one big enough for a shelf or display. I'm really excited to add this to my decor this year. For this project, I used one of these cream-colored pumpkins from Walmart. I started by cutting off the little vine from the tip of the stem. Then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the stem. I also went around the base of the stem to where the indentions in the section start with the ink chalk paint. I also took a pointed paintbrush and used it to paint a little ways down the indentions with the same ink chalk paint. Here is how the pumpkin looked once all the indentions and top were painted. I then took some Krylon chalky finished antiquing wax in the color Dark Vintage and a wax brush and brushed it onto the pumpkin, paying extra attention to the indentions between the sections. I brushed on the wax, then immediately took a paper towel and wiped off the excess. I continued to repeat this process over the entire pumpkin until I was happy with the way it looked. Next, I picked out 9 of these bats in different sizes from this 30 pack that I picked up at Five Below. Once I had all the bats picked out, I folded their wings along the scored edges so that they looked like they were in flight, and then used hot glue to attach them to the pumpkin. I started attaching the bats at the bottom of the pumpkin and then continued adding bats in a diagonal direction all along the front. I put the smallest bats at the bottom and at the top of the pumpkin, with the larger bats closer to the center to give it the illusion of the bats flying across the pumpkin. And that's it for this one. It was super easy to make, and I love how it turned out. For this project, I used a 16 by 20 inch canvas from the Plus section at Dollar Tree. I started by carefully using a flathead screwdriver and a pair of pliers to remove all the staples from the back of the canvas so I could remove it from the wooden frame. Once I had all the staples removed, I removed the canvas from the frame and set the frame aside. Next, I flipped the canvas over and flattened it out so that I would be working on the front side. I took a 10.5 inch plate from Walmart, but you could use any round object you have on hand, and placed it upside down in the center of the canvas. I then took Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and painted all around the plate, holding it in place so that I would have a perfect circle once it was removed. While I was painting, I tried not to get too much paint in any one area. I wanted some of the white canvas showing through in several places. If I did happen to get too much paint in one area, I simply took a baby wipe and took off some of the paint while it was still wet. Once I was happy with the way the canvas looked, I carefully removed the plate while the paint was still a little wet and took a paper towel and went around the outside of the circle to blend the edges and smudge the moon a bit to make it look a little more organic. Going back to the frame, I went ahead and used a flathead screwdriver and some pliers to remove the 4 staples in each of the corners of the front of the frame. I did end up flipping the frame over and putting a staple in each of the 4 corners on the back side to help hold it together. Next, I centered the frame so that the moon was in the center and used a small dab of hot glue in each of the corners to tack the canvas in place so I could flip it over and staple it to the frame. You don't have to use staples to attach the canvas to the frame. You could use hot glue and it would work just as well. Once I had all the staples in place, I took a sharp utility knife and carefully cut away all the excess canvas by cutting along the outside of the staples. Then I took 8 bats of varying sizes from the same pack of bats that I used in the first DIY and bent their wings and arranged them on the canvas to look like they were flying across the moon. Again, I put the smaller bats closer to the top and bottom of the moon and the larger bats on the moon. When I was happy with the placement of the bats, I used a small dab of hot glue to attach them to the canvas. I found that it is much easier to apply the glue directly to the canvas and allow it to cool for a few seconds before putting the bats on top so they don't bubble. Then, to finish off this project, since it will be hanging above my bed, I put a large sawtooth hanger in the center of the top back of the frame. I am beyond thrilled with how this project turned out. I've been waiting to make this one for a long time, and I really don't know why it's took so long. For this first project, I used a wooden bee and 2 wooden nose that I picked up on sale for $1.99 each at Hobby Lobby. I started by painting all 3 letters with 1 coat of Waverly chalk paint in the color white. To make the templates for the spider webs, I traced a small spider web and a large spider web onto a piece of printer paper. Then I took a piece of wax paper and taped it over the templates. I used 4 toothpicks for the frame of the small web. I started by laying a toothpick on the top main line of the web, making sure the tip was flush with the back. Next, I took a pencil and marked the other end of the toothpick so that it would be the exact same length as the line on the paper. I then repeated this step with the other 3 toothpicks, placing 1 on each of the other 3 main lines. Once I had all 4 toothpicks marked, I took a pair of miter shears and cut them all to size. After I had them all cut, I put a fairly large dab of hot glue at the base of the web directly onto the wax paper. While the glue was still liquid, I placed each of the toothpicks back onto each of the lines, making sure to put the cut side into the glue and that the pointed ends were the outside tips of the web. I made sure to get the toothpicks lined up with the lines the best I could before the glue set up completely. I would recommend a high-temp glue gun for this project if you have one, so that you have a little more time to place the toothpicks before the glue sets up. Once I had all the toothpicks in place, I added another generous layer of hot glue directly on top of the cut ends of the toothpicks and set it aside to give the glue time to fully set up. After the glue had fully set up, I removed the frame from the wax paper and used a pair of sharp scissors to trim up the glue so that it was nice and neat. I do want to say I was a bit worried about the structural integrity of the frames, but I used Gorilla Glue hot glue sticks, and once it was set up, the frame was good and sturdy. I then repeated these steps to make 2 of the larger spider web frames. Here is how all 3 of the webs turned out. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the front and back of all the frames. Once the frames were completely dry, I placed the small frame back down onto the template, and using a pencil I made small marks on the toothpicks where each of the strands of the webs was supposed to be, so that I would have a guide to follow. Then I took some black embroidery floss, and starting at one end at the top mark, I wrapped the floss around the toothpick a couple of times and tied it in a double knot to secure it. After I had the floss secured on the first toothpick, I then continued to wrap the floss around each of the toothpicks a couple of times and secured them with double knots each time until I had it across all 4 toothpicks. Once I had the floss around each of the toothpicks, I went back to each end and wrapped the extra floss around the toothpick a few more times, then secured the ends with small dabs of hot glue and cut off any of the excess floss. I repeated these steps to make the other 3 sections. Here is how the small web turned out once it was completely finished. I then repeated these steps on the 2 large frames to complete the large spider webs. After I had all 3 spider webs made, I placed one on each of the letters similar to how they are in the original inspiration piece from Grandin Road and used hot glue to secure them in place. I would highly recommend using a stronger adhesive along with the hot glue for a more permanent hold. Once the 3 spider webs were attached to the letters, this project was finished. I am so happy with the way this project turned out, not to mention that I was able to make my boo letters for only $6.50. For this project, I used one of these 19.5-inch wood circles with the keyhole that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. I always wait until the wood crafts go on sale at Hobby Lobby to get all my wood supplies. I started by painting the front and sides of the circle with Waverly chalk paint in the color white. Next, I used one of these cat ornaments and one of these witch hat ornaments from Dollar Tree. I took some wood filler and filled up the holes on the top of both ornaments and set them aside to dry. Once the wood filler was completely dry, I took some sandpaper and sanded the area on the front side where I filled the holes so that both ornaments were nice and smooth. I then painted the front and sides of both ornaments with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. Since the numbers on the inspiration piece are 3D, I used my Cricut to cut out the numbers in cardstock. I cut each number out 8 times and used a glue stick to stack them all together to create one solid 3D number. I started by putting glue on the bottom number and placed another number directly on top, making sure they were lined up exactly, and wiped off the excess glue. I repeated this step until I had all 8 of the numbers stacked together to create one solid number and set it aside so the glue could fully dry. If you wanted, you could skip this step and use stickers, wood numbers, stencils, or vinyl for the numbers. I just wanted to have mine 3D, and this was the cheapest way I found to make them. I then repeated these steps until I had all 31 numbers assembled. Once all the numbers were completely dry, I painted the front and sides with Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin. I also cut out 3 of each of these stars and painted them with the pumpkin paint as well. Next, I cut out the words "The witching hour draws near," 3 different bats and a raven in cardstock, and repeated the same steps I followed to assemble the numbers to make the letters bats and raven 3D. I painted the front and sides of all the letters, bats, and raven with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. Next, I took the template I was making to hand draw this countdown calendar before I decided to make it 3D and placed it onto the wood circle and used a straight edge to mark where each of the vertical lines go on the circle. The template is not needed for this step, but because I had the lines marked on the template, I decided to go ahead and use it. All you'll need to do is space out the 6 vertical lines evenly across the front of the circle. Once I had all 6 lines marked out, I used the black washi tape out of this pack that I got on sale at Hobby Lobby to create the lines on the front of the circle. I lined up the washi tape so that the line that I marked was in the middle and applied the tape in a straight line to the bottom of the circle. I then repeated this step to put the remaining 5 lines on the front of the circle so that it would look similar to shiplap. Next, I took the numbers and arranged them around the outside edge of the circle, similar to that of a clock, and so that they were evenly spaced. I just eyeballed the spacing. I didn't want to get too technical with a ruler. I did, however, make sure the number 31 was lined up perfectly with the keyhole on the back of the circle so that the calendar would hang straight on the wall. When I was happy with the placement of all the numbers, I took some hot glue and attached them to the circle. I would recommend using a different glue for this step. Hot glue holds great, but it's a bit messy and set up way too fast to fix any problems. I think if I were to remake this project, I would use tacky glue, Mod Podge, or just a regular school glue stick. After I had all the numbers glued in place, I took the rest of the pieces and placed them in the middle of the circle arranged like the inspiration piece. When I was happy with the placement of all the pieces, I used hot glue to hold them in place. Here is how it looked once everything was glued into place. I used the 7-inch hand from this set of clock hands that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I also used one of these large antique tacks from Hobby Lobby and a small wooden bead from Amazon. I painted the clock hand, tack, and bead with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. I found the center of the circle and marked it so that I would know exactly where to put the countdown hand. To assemble the clock hand, I put the tack in the hole on the back of the hand and then placed the wooden bead onto the bottom of the tack so that the hand would be elevated over the words. Once I had the countdown hand put together, I pushed it down into the wood where I marked the center and took a hammer and lightly hammered it down into the wood just enough so that the hand was secure and snug, but that I was also able to move it by hand, and this one is finished. Y'all, I am so excited with how this one turned out. I love all of today's projects, but this one has to be my absolute favorite. I've been wanting one of these countdown calendars ever since I seen it, but I didn't want to spend that much, and I was able to make mine for about $17 in a little bit of time. For this super quick and easy project, I used 6 of these skeleton bats from Dollar Tree. I started by painting all 6 of them with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. I would recommend a matte black spray paint to make this project even quicker and easier. I just didn't have any on hand. Once the bats were completely dry, I took them outside and gave the front and back of each bat a couple coats of Mod Podge matte clear acrylic sealer, and these little guys are done. It truly is amazing what a simple coat of paint can do to some Dollar Tree items. I am literally obsessed with these little bats, but then again, I'm a bat girl through and through. They are one of my favorite animals year-round, not just for Halloween. These little bats turned out to be the perfect dupe to the Grandin Road bats, and best of all, mine only cost $7.50 since I had the paint and sealer on hand. To make the frame for this sign, I used 3 of these 1x2 white wood boards that are 4 feet long that I picked up at Lowe's. I started by cutting 2 pieces at 20 inches long with 45-degree angles on each end, and 2 pieces at 30 inches long with 45-degree angles on each end. I laid out the wood pieces to form the frame and used wood glue to attach the pieces together. I also went ahead and used a nail gun to put a couple of small nails in each of the corners for added security. After allowing the wood glue to set up overnight, I took some stainable wood filler and filled in all the cracks and nail holes in all 4 corners and set it aside to dry. Once the wood filler was completely dry, I took some sandpaper and smoothed down all the areas I filled with the wood filler. Next, I used Rust-Oleum stain in the color Kona to stain the front and sides of the frame. Once the frame was completely dry, I flipped it over and placed one of these black foam ready boards from Dollar Tree on the back side and used a stapler to secure it in place. You could also use a hot glue to attach the foam board to the frame if you wanted. I made the frame the same size as the ready board, so it was an almost perfect fit, but I did end up having to use a sharp utility knife to trim the foam board in a couple of areas so that it couldn't be seen over the frame. Since the words on the inspiration piece from Grandin Road are 3D, I decided to go ahead and make the words on mine 3D as well. I cut all the words, letters, and broom out of cardstock 9 times using my Cricut and assembled them the same way I did for the countdown clock. Now, if you don't have a Cricut or don't want to make them 3D, you could trace the design onto the paper and then onto the foam board and fill it in with a white paint marker like I have done for previous projects here on my channel. Once the glue on the words and broom was completely dry, I painted the fronts and sides with 1 coat of Waverly chalk paint in the color Snow White. For the frame inside the frame, I cut out the corners and sides out of cardstock and assembled them in the same way I did the words. Here you can see I did have to glue 2 of the straight pieces together to get the pieces for the top and bottom of the frame. I did this with wood glue, but tacky glue or school glue would work as well. I arranged all the pieces to create the frame and then took some wood glue and attached all the pieces together. Once the frame was dry, I took some wood filler and filled in all the areas where the frame was glued together. When the wood filler was completely dry, I took a piece of sandpaper and sanded all the areas where I put the wood filler so that it would be nice and smooth. Then I painted the front and sides of the frame with a couple coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color Snow White. When the frame was completely dry, I placed it inside the wood frame on the foam board and used hot glue to secure it in place. Again, I would recommend using tacky glue or a glue stick to adhere this frame to the foam board because hot glue is messy and sets up way too quick. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the foam board around the frame. This step is completely optional, but I wanted to clean up some of the hot glue mess, and I wanted the background of the sign to be a bit darker than the color of the foam board. Once the foam board was completely dry, I placed the broom and all the words onto the sign like they are on the inspiration piece. When I was happy with the placement of the broom and the words, I got smart and used a glue stick to attach them to the foam board. I used a ruler to keep the letters straight and evenly spaced while gluing them down. I set the sign aside and allowed the glue to set up for a couple of hours before adding a sawtooth hanger to the back so that it could be hung on the wall. Then to finish up this project, I used the Rust-Oleum Kona stain and stained the edges of the foam board so that it would blend into the frame. I am super happy with how this sign turned out, and it only cost me $6.17. For this project, I used one of these 8x8 craftwood pallets from Dollar General. I began by removing the picture hanger and the kickstand from the back of the pallet. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the first and third slat, as well as the pieces on the back of the pallet holding the slats together. I then used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin to paint the second slat. And finally, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color moss to paint the last slat. I used Krylon antiquing wax in the color dark vintage and dry brushed just the third slat to give it an aged and distressed look. Next, I sketched out the faces of the 4 monsters onto the palette. I decided to go with a ghost, a jack-o'-lantern, a mummy, and Frankenstein. I used Waverly chalk paints in the colors Ink, Maze, and Snow White, along with apple barrel paint in the color spring green to paint all of the details on each of the palette slats, and this one is finished. Y'all, this one turned out so cute. I'm not one for cute Halloween decor, but this little piece has a piece of my heart. For this project, I used one of these cotton mop heads and one of these glass vases, both from Dollar Tree. I began by flipping the mop head upside down so that I could see the plastic centerpiece that's holding it together, and applied a generous amount of hot glue to the plastic and placed it down on the bottom of the vase, then held it in place until the glue set up. I used Gorilla Glue hot glue sticks, and they seem to work pretty well for this, but you could also use E6000 or a stronger adhesive for a more permanent hold. Once the mop was secured in place, I went around and untwisted all the strands of cotton. Here is how the ghost looked once it was put together. Next, I used one of these small tinsel witch hats from Dollar Tree. I removed all of the tinsel from the hat and used some scissors to cut off all the plastic tabs that were used to secure the tinsel in place. I then used some of this black acrylic yarn from Walmart to wrap the entire brim of the hat using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. Next, I used some of this dark purple acrylic yarn from Walmart and wrapped it around the bottom part of the hat to create about a 1-inch band around the bottom of the hat using hot glue as needed to secure it in place. Once I had the hat band in place, I used more of this black acrylic yarn to wrap the remainder of the hat, again using hot glue as needed. I used some of this Yarn Bee yarn in the color Honey to wrap the buckle for the hat using hot glue to attach it to the buckle. After I had everything wrapped with the yarn, I used small dabs of hot glue on the edges of the buckle and attached it to the hat in the center of the purple band. I used some of this black felt from Hobby Lobby to create the eyes for the ghost. I liked the shape of the handle of the scissors, so I used a marker to trace the inside of the handle onto the felt and cut it out. I then used some hot glue to attach the felt eyes to the ghost. To finish up this project, I used some of these warm white LED string lights from Dollar Tree and placed them inside the vase, then placed the hat on top to cover up the plastic piece of mop head, and that's it for this one. I just love this ghost. Not only is it adorable, but it makes a great little light to give the room a nice cozy feeling at night. For this project, I used 3 of these large plastic rats from Dollar Tree and used a pair of scissors to remove their tails. I also used one of these 8-inch plastic cauldrons from Amazon and used scissors to cut off the handle, keeping the small peg-like pieces from inside the cauldron. I then placed some hot glue inside the handle hole and replaced the peg, this time letting the pointed end face outwards to fill up the hole. I also repeated this step on the other side to fill in the other handle hole. Next, I arranged the 3 rats so that they would hold the cauldron up and so that it would be level, and placed hot glue on the back of the rats where they came into contact with the bottom of the cauldron and placed it on top, holding it in place long enough for the glue to set up. Once the glue was set up, I flipped the cauldron upside down and added just a dab of glue to the tips of each of the rat tails to secure them together for a bit more added security. I took it outside and gave it a couple coats of Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color flat black. I used one of these 8-inch bamboo rings from Amazon and painted it with a coat of Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color flat black. I also used some of these clear plastic Christmas ornaments that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby and removed all of the silver tops so that I was left with just the plastic globe. Once the paint was completely dry, I placed the bamboo ring on top of the cauldron and started attaching the ornaments using hot glue to create bubbles. Now I wanted to be able to remove the bubbles from the cauldron since I decided to use a mister and needed to be able to add and remove water, so that's why I opted to use the bamboo ring. If you don't want to remove the bubbles, you can skip the ring altogether and attach the ornaments directly to the cauldron. I continued adding the ornaments to the top of the cauldron until I was happy with the way it looked, using hot glue to secure them in place. Here is how the bubble topper turned out. I used folk art brushed metal paint in the color sterling silver and painted both handles on the cauldron with 2 good coats, and then heavily dry brushed the sides of the cauldrons and the rats to age it a bit. Next, I used a 3/8-inch drill bit to drill a hole in the back of the cauldron just below the lip. I then used one of these mist makers from Amazon and placed the cord attached to the mister through the hole in the back of the cauldron, and then pushed the rubber stopper into the hole to seal it from leaking. Once I had the mister in place inside the cauldron, I attached the cord with the plug to the mister cord and filled the bottom of the cauldron with enough water to completely cover the mister, then placed the bubbles on top of the cauldron, and this one is finished. I'm going to be completely honest with this one. I actually prefer it without the bubbles the best because you can see the mist better, although the colors coming through the clear ornaments are beautiful as well. You'll have to let me know in the comments which look you like the best. For this project, I used 3 of these metal candlesticks from Dollar Tree, 1 in each of the 3 sizes. I also used 2 of these metal bat tree toppers, a witch tree topper, and a crow tree topper, all from Dollar Tree as well. I began by using some wire cutters to remove the parts of the tree toppers that actually go onto the top of a tree. I used Gorilla Super Glue to attach the metal figures to the candlesticks. For the tallest candlestick, I used 2 of the metal bats and applied a small dab of super glue to the back of the bats where they come into contact with the candlestick, then placed them on the candlestick, holding them for about 10 seconds until the glue dried enough to hold them in place. I then repeated this step to attach the crow to the middle-sized candlestick. And finally, I repeated this step to attach the witch to the shortest candlestick. I do want to mention that it takes about 24 hours for this super glue to fully cure, so I let them set overnight before adding the candles, and this one is finished. I am in love with these super simple candlesticks, and I think they're going to be another permanent addition to my makeup room. For this project, I used this 5.5 by 7.5 inch piece of wood from this wood economy bag from Hobby Lobby and one of these 6-inch wooden table legs I picked up at Lowe's. I started by removing the screw from the end of the table leg and used wood glue to attach it to the center of the wood piece and set it aside to dry for a few hours. I also used one of these 6-inch, 8-inch, and 10-inch bamboo rings from this multi-pack that I got from Amazon. I have put these in my Amazon storefront, and I will link that in the description box below. I used wood glue to attach the 8-inch ring to the top of the 10-inch ring and used a clamp to hold them together long enough for the glue to set up. I then used more wood glue to attach the 6-inch ring to the top of the 8-inch ring, again using a clamp to hold them together, and set the whole piece aside to dry for a few hours. Once the glue on the rings was completely dry, I took a small drill bit and drilled a hole through the bottom of the 10-inch ring right in the center. Next, I used Minwax wood finish semi-transparent in the color ebony to stain the base and bamboo rings with one coat and set it aside to dry for a couple of hours. After all the pieces were completely dry, I used a small screw to attach the rings to the center of the top of the table leg. Here's how the piece looked once it was completely assembled. Next, I took some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach it to the bottom of the 10-inch ring. I then repeated this step to attach more Spanish moss to the bottoms of the other two rings. I apologize that I was unable to get the whole project in frame due to my tripod being a little too short, but here's how the piece looks with all the moss in place. Next, I used 3 of these fake crows that I picked up in this 6-pack from Amazon. Again, these are in my Amazon storefront that is going to be linked below. I cut the wire pieces from the bottom of one of the crow's feet and then used hot glue to attach it in the center at the bottom of the 10-inch ring. I then repeated this step to attach the other 2 crows to the other 2 rings, with each one of them positioned just a little bit differently, and this one is finished. I have a love of crows and ravens, so I really do love how this topiary turned out. It's slightly on the taller side, so I will probably be using this as a focal piece on my entryway table. For this project, I used one of these spider-shaped candy holders from Dollar Tree and used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint it with 2 good coats. Once the paint was completely dry, I took some of this cream eyeshadow in the color Gold Rush and using my finger rubbed it across all of the high points of the spider to give it a more aged and antiqued look. Now I wanted to use Rub and Buff and bronze for this step, but none of the stores around my area except Hobby Lobby carry it, and it was Sunday so they were closed, but I am happy with the way the eyeshadow ended up looking. It gives it an aged look with a little bit of a shimmer. I also used one of these orb-shaped terrariums from Dollar Tree. I removed the hanger and used some painter's tape to cover the hole in the side of the orb and the hole from where the hanger was removed. Next, I took some satin Mod Podge and poured it into a smaller container. I wanted to tint the orb black, so I took some red, blue, and green food coloring and added several drops of each into the Mod Podge and mixed it up really well, adding more drops of food coloring as needed to achieve the color I wanted. The food coloring does thin out the Mod Podge, so there was no need for me to add any extra water to get the consistency that I was looking for. Once I was happy with the color, I poured the Mod Podge mixture into the front of the terrarium and twisted it around in order to coat the entire inside of the orb, adding more of the mixture as needed. After I had the inside completely coated, I poured out the excess Mod Podge and carefully removed the tape, then placed the orb upside down on a paper plate to drain any excess liquid and to dry for several hours. Here is how the orb looked once it was completely dry. It's a dark semi-transparent color, which is exactly what I wanted. Next, I used some of these color-changing LED wire lights from the Family Dollar and fed them through the hole in the top of the terrarium where the hanger used to be. Once I had all the lights inside the orb, I used a small dab of hot glue on the side of the hole to secure the lights in place. I then applied some hot glue around the opening of the orb and placed it down inside the dish of the spider, making sure the hole where I secured the lights was facing the back of the spider. I added a small dab of hot glue on the bottom of the spider to secure the light string so that it would be mostly hidden underneath the spider. To help hide the battery box, I cut off the plastic loop at the top, then gathered all the excess cord up underneath it and placed the box and the wire inside the head groove underneath the spider and used hot glue to secure it in place. I used one of these command picture hanging strips to hang up the spider sconce, and this project is finished. I am thrilled with the way these spider sconces turned out. I think they're going to be the perfect addition to my entryway this spooky season. For this project, I used one of these pink flamingos from Dollar Tree. I started by removing the silver stakes and used painter's tape along with a plastic bag to cover up the body of the flamingo, leaving only its head exposed. I then took it outside and gave the head of the flamingo a couple coats of Rust-Oleum gloss spray paint in the color cranberry. Once the paint was completely dry, I used more painter's tape and half of a plastic bag to cover up the head. I then took it back outside and gave the body a couple coats of Rust-Oleum Ultra Matte spray paint in the color black. After all the spray paint was completely dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the colors Snow White, Ink, and Maze to add the details back into the eyes and the beak. To make the feathers, I used this feather boa that I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I cut the string off of one end and wrapped it around the base of the flamingo's neck to measure out about how much I needed and cut it to size. I then used hot glue to attach it around the base of the neck and fluffed it up a little bit. To finish this project, I simply put the stakes into place, and this flamingo vulture is ready to be placed in my flower pot out by the stairs. I love these little guys so much that I made two, and I plan on picking up some more of the flamingos from Dollar Tree next summer so I can create a whole flamingo vulture committee next Halloween. For this project, I used this white, black, and orange balloon from this pack of latex balloons from Dollar Tree, as well as some of these cotton balls from Dollar Tree. I started by taking one of the cotton balls and pulling it apart to separate the fibers and fluff it up. I then placed it inside the white balloon. I found the easiest way to get the cotton inside the balloon was to use a long tool with a blunt end. I continued to fluff up the cotton balls and place them inside the body of the balloon until I was happy with the fullness. Once I was happy with the way the balloon looked, I went ahead and tied a knot in the end. I then repeated this step to fill the black and orange balloons. Next, I used some of these vintage-looking rub-on transfers from Dollar Tree. I cut out the largest ghost and placed it in the center of the white balloon and used a blunt tip tool to transfer it onto the surface of the balloon. The tool I'm using here is from a set of cake decorating tools that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I put this cute pumpkin transfer onto the front of the orange balloon and this scaredy cat transfer onto the front of the black balloon. Next, I used one of these black coffee stir sticks for the balloon stick and used hot glue to attach it to the back of the balloon. I then repeated this step to add the sticks to the other two balloons. I used some of this white gift ribbon from Dollar Tree and tied it around the neck of the balloon in a double knot and used a pair of scissors to curl the ends. I decided I needed an orange and black ribbon on the balloon, so I took a strip of the white ribbon and used a black Sharpie marker to color the black ribbon and did the same thing with the orange Sharpie to color the orange ribbon. I then repeated these steps to add the ribbons to the orange and black balloons. Next, I used one of these 2.5-inch clay pots from Dollar Tree to create a base. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and painted the outside of the pot with one good coat. Once the paint was dry, I took some Krylon antiquing wax in the color dark vintage and heavily dry brushed the outside and bottom of the pot. I used hot glue to attach a small piece of floral foam in the bottom of the pot and then cut down the balloon sticks and placed them down inside the floral foam through the hole on the bottom of the clay pot, placing all three balloons at different heights, and this one is finished. I think this little balloon arrangement turned out super cute, and I'm really loving the vintage inspired images on them. For this project, I cut 2 squares out of cardstock that are roughly 3.75 inches wide and 3.75 inches tall, and used hot glue to glue them together along 3 of the 4 edges, leaving one edge free to open to create a record sleeve. Next, I went to Google and searched for vintage Halloween vinyl records and found this really neat cover from the 1960s and sized it down to fit the cardstock sleeve, then printed it out. I used a regular school glue stick to adhere the printout to the front of the cardstock and cut off any of the excess paper that was hanging over the edge of the record sleeve. I used one of these 3-inch wooden circles from this pack that I picked up at Walmart to create the vinyl record. I wanted this circle to look as much like an old vinyl record as possible, so I took a drill with a small drill bit and drilled a hole in the center of the circle. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the front and back of the wooden circle with one coat. And because sometimes I can be a little bit extra, I went ahead and printed out a small circle from the center of the image that I used on the sleeve and used a glue stick to adhere it to the center of the wooden circle. Once the glue had set up, I took a pair of small scissors and, going from the front side of the wooden circle, opened the hole back up in the center. Then, to finish up this project, I placed half of the vinyl record inside of the record sleeve, and that's it for this one. I loved how this one turned out, so much so that I went ahead and made another one using this record cover from the 1950s. I am obsessed with these, and I think they are the perfect addition to my tiered tray. For this project, I used one of these 7-inch wooden circle plaques from Walmart and used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint the entire plaque with one coat. Next, I went over to Google and searched for vintage Man in the Moon stencils and found this image and resized it to fit on the plaque, then printed it out. I then took a pencil and shaded in the details on the back of the paper so that I could easily transfer the image onto the plaque. After I had the back shaded, I placed the image down on the front of the plaque in the center and used a couple pieces of Scotch tape to hold it in place. I then traced the face and its features to transfer it over to the plaque and then remove the template. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to fill in all the details of the face. I painted 2 of the tumbling tower blocks from Dollar Tree with Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and used hot glue to attach them to the bottom back side of the plaque so that it stands on its own, and this one is finished. I love how this one turned out. It was super simple and quick to make, but it makes a huge statement on my tiered tray. I absolutely love how all these DIYs came together to create a fun vintage Halloween display. For this project, I used this orange foam pumpkin from the Dollar Tree and removed the stem. I also used this candy corn pumpkin that's a bit smaller from Dollar Tree and removed the stick and the stem. I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster and mixed it with baking soda to create a paste-like consistency, then gave both pumpkins 2 healthy coats, letting them fully dry between the coats. I really love the stone texture that this mixture gave to these pumpkins. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color truffle to paint the stem of the small pumpkin. When that was dry, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color hazelnut and lightly dry brushed the stem to give it some dimension. After the pumpkins were dry, I used a pencil to sketch out quotation marks in front of the word never onto the front of the small pumpkin and the word more followed by quotation marks onto the front of the large pumpkin. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the words on the pumpkins. Once that was dry, I used hot glue to attach the small pumpkin on top of the larger pumpkin, making sure the words were lined up properly. I then used hot glue to reattach the stem in the top of the small pumpkin. Next, I took some Spanish moss from the Dollar Tree and used hot glue to attach it around the stem. I also used one of these crows that I got in this 6-pack from Amazon, and these will be linked in my Amazon shop below. I did go ahead and cut the wire off the bottom of the crow's feet. I found one of these tiny skulls in my stash and painted it with apple barrel paint in the color antique white and used a Sharpie to fill in the eyes and nose. I took a piece of twine and fed it through the holes on the back of the skull and used a small dab of hot glue to attach the two ends of twine together and cut off the excess twine. I then used hot glue to attach the twine underneath the crow's beak so that it looked like he was carrying the skull. And to finish off this project, I applied hot glue to the bottom of the crow's feet and attached him to the top of the small pumpkin. This is one of my all-time favorite Halloween DIYs, and I have a feeling it's going to be a year-round decor piece. For this project, I used 3 of these short LED emergency candles from the Dollar Tree. I started by using a hot glue gun to create wax strips of different lengths down the side of the candle coming from the top. I repeated this step to add wax strips to the other 2 candles. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to paint one of the candles with 2 good coats. Once that dried, it's a bit hard to see here, but I used a pencil to lightly sketch the face of a ghost onto the candle. For the second candle, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and gave it 2 good coats. Once that was dry, I sketched out the face of a jack-o'-lantern onto the candle. And finally, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color moss to paint the last candle with 2 good coats. Once that was dry, I sketched out the face of Frankenstein onto the candle, and again, this one is a little difficult to see on camera. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and a small paintbrush to fill in the faces on each candle. I also used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the candle bases with 2 good coats, and this one is finished. I decided I wanted to display these candles on these black metal candle holders from the Dollar Tree, so I removed the bases from all the candles except the ghost and placed them inside the candle holders. But seriously, how cute are these little guys? For this project, I used one of these wooden haunted house cutouts from the Dollar Tree and started by removing the hanger and used wood filler to fill in the hole. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink mixed with some baking soda to create a stone-like texture and gave the entire house 2 thick coats. Once the paint was dry, I used folk art brushed metal paint in the color brushed silver and a stencil brush to heavily dry brush the entire house to give it an old and worn look. After that was dry, I took a pencil and sketched out the words Black Cat Cafe right above the door and the words Open Till Dawn on the door. I then used apple barrel paint in the color antique white to paint the words, and this did end up taking a couple of coats. Next, I used some parchment paper and cut out a square large enough to cover one of the windows and used Gorilla Glue super glue to attach it to the back side of the house, covering up the window. I then repeated this step to cover all the windows and the door on the back side of the house. I wanted the back to look a little bit neater, so I went ahead and trimmed up the parchment paper and carefully went around the edges with the ink chalk paint to blend them in. I cut this tiny cat with a witch's hat out of some printer paper and colored it in with a black Sharpie. I applied a thin layer of Mod Podge on the parchment paper over the window right above the door on the back side of the cafe and placed the cat so that it looked like it was sitting on the windowsill inside the cafe and pressed it down and smoothed out the wrinkles. I then went ahead and added another layer of the Mod Podge on top of the cat once the first layer was dry to seal it. You can't really see it here, but once a light is placed behind the house, the cat really pops out in the window. I used one of these long wooden planks from this pack from Dollar Tree and painted it to match the cafe for the base. Once the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach the plank to the back of the cafe at the bottom so that it will stand on its own. I used one of these wooden circles from this pack from Walmart to create a full moon. I started by using Waverly chalk paint in the color maize to paint the circle. Next, I used apple barrel paint in the color bright yellow and a stencil brush to stipple the paint onto the circle. I then alternated between the bright yellow and the maize colors to add more dimension and detail into the front of the moon, again using a stippling technique. I wanted more dimension, so I added some apple barrel paint in the color antique white and continued to alternate between the 3 colors. Now, I still wasn't happy with it, so I added in Waverly chalk paint in the color pumpkin and mixed it with the 2 yellow colors and blended it closer to the center of the moon, and this was exactly the look I was going for. Once the moon was dry, I used hot glue to attach it to the top right of the cafe. For more detail, I took 5 of the small bats from this transfer sheet from the Dollar Tree and placed them to look like they were flying across the moon. Once I was happy with the placements of the bats, I transferred them one at a time by removing the backing from the transfer and using a tool with a blunt end to carefully rub the top of the bat to transfer it from the plastic to the moon. Next, I took these spider LED string lights from the Dollar Tree and carefully popped the little spiders off of the lights. A little hint here, if you heat them up just a little, they come off a whole lot easier. Once I had the lights spider-free, I used hot glue to attach them to the back side of the house, winding them around and in between the windows, and this one is finished. I know this one took a few extra steps, but they were so worth it. I am thrilled with the way this turned out, and it looks so cool at night with the little witch cat in the window.